Trauma leaves deep scars on the mind and body, changing a person's life in ways that can never fully be undone. In his book The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk sheds light on these hidden scars, inviting the reader into a world where trauma isn't just a psychological issue, but one that imprints itself on every cell of the body. He argues that healing from trauma involves understanding both its mental and physical effects. But what exactly is trauma? How does it affect the brain and body? The answers to these questions hold the key to recovery after trauma. The deep effects of trauma on the brain and body. When someone experiences trauma, their brain goes into a state of constant alert, as if they are always in danger. This disrupts the brain's normal functioning. As van der Kolk explains, traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. This means trauma imprints itself not just on the conscious mind, but also on the body's memory, deeply influencing a person's emotional world. During a traumatic event, the brain starts recording the danger and the moment itself. This recording mechanism is an evolutionary survival tool, but after trauma, the brain continues to act as if the danger is still present, making it difficult for a person to lead a normal life. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes overly sensitive after a traumatic experience. The individual feels like they are always under threat, even in safe situations. Van der Kolk captures this by stating, the fight-or-flight response doesn't just happen during trauma. It holds your brain hostage long after. But trauma doesn't stop with the mind, it extends to the body as well. The body keeps the score, as van der Kolk famously puts it, signaling that the physical impact of trauma is as significant as the mental one. These physical effects manifest as chronic tension, stress, muscle pain, and even sleep disturbances. The emotional impact of trauma, losing emotional balance. The psychological effects of trauma are like a storm that upends a person's emotional world. People who have experienced trauma often feel unsafe, even when they are in a completely secure environment. Van der Kolk notes that traumatized people tend to experience life through a lens of danger. This constant sense of threat damages relationships, making it difficult for trauma survivors to feel connected or trust others. They may feel isolated, abandoned, or worthless. The deeper issue lies in how these individuals repeatedly relive their traumatic experiences in their minds. Trauma creates a cycle where memories of the event intrude on everyday life, often without the person's control. The struggle with the past is a battle that never seems to end, as individuals find themselves reliving the same trauma over and over. Van der Kolk explains, these recurring memories cause the individual to feel as if they are trapped in the trauma, unable to move forward. The path to healing from trauma, understanding the effects of trauma, is the first step toward healing. While it may not be possible to erase the impact of trauma, it is possible to find ways to manage it, says van der Kolk, emphasizing that recovery requires addressing both the mind and body. Body-focused therapies, mindfulness, and yoga are some of the methods that help trauma survivors restore balance to their lives. To heal from trauma, you must also heal the body, van der Kolk states, highlighting the importance of addressing the physical aspects of trauma. Although it's impossible to completely erase the neural imprints left by trauma, it is possible to stop those imprints from controlling a person's life. Conclusion: understanding trauma and the journey to recovery. Understanding trauma is crucial to beginning the journey of recovery. Recognizing how the brain and body respond to trauma helps individuals better cope with the challenges that arise after the experience. Trauma is not just a mental injury, the body carries its scars as well. Yet when individuals understand both aspects of trauma, they can begin to heal those wounds. As van der Kolk explains, understanding trauma is the first step to healing it. Ultimately, understanding trauma not only helps people comprehend themselves better, but also opens the door to new ways of living. Freeing oneself from the shadow of trauma is possible through the combined healing of both the body and the mind. The insights provided in this section offer a guide for managing the effects of trauma and Van der Kolk's deep research shows how the brain and body work together in this process. The effects of trauma on the brain and body are a central focus in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, where he reveals how deeply trauma imprints on both our physical and mental states. Trauma is not just a psychological experience, it leaves lasting traces in the body as well. In this chapter, Van der Kolk explores how the brain and body respond to trauma, working together to record the event, and how those marks can be understood and healed. Trauma, much like a storm, disrupts the normal functioning of the brain, but its impact reaches far beyond the mind, affecting the body at its core. How the brain records danger. When a traumatic event occurs, the brain immediately reacts to the threat. The amygdala, a part of the brain that is responsible for detecting fear and danger, plays a crucial role in this process. Normally, the amygdala activates the fight, flight, or freeze response when a threat is perceived. However, after trauma, this response can become a permanent fixture in a person's life. Van der Kolk describes this condition vividly. Trauma keeps your brain constantly on high alert, never allowing you to relax, even for a moment. This means that even in situations where there is no actual danger, the brain perceives a threat. A sound, a smell, or a sight can trigger memories of the traumatic event, causing the individual to relive the experience as if it were happening all over again. This constant state of vigilance affects the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, decision-making, and emotional regulation. In trauma survivors, the prefrontal cortex becomes less effective, making it harder to think clearly or make rational decisions. Van der Kolk notes, in traumatized individuals, rational thought gives way to panic, illustrating how deeply trauma disrupts the brain's ability to function normally. Trauma's impact on the body remembers too. The effects of trauma are not confined to the brain, the body also bears the burden. Trauma leaves a physical imprint that manifests through various symptoms. Van der Kolk highlights this with a powerful statement. The greatest paradox of trauma is that the body records it without our conscious awareness, emphasizing that trauma is more than a mental experience, it becomes a physical one. During a traumatic event, the body goes into survival mode. This response is essential for getting through the event itself. However, if the body's alarm system remains activated after the trauma, it leads to chronic stress, muscle tension, headaches, and digestive problems. Van der Kolk explains how, after trauma, the body continues to produce high levels of stress hormones. These hormones reinforce the physical impact of trauma. Trauma keeps your body in a constant state of alertness. Your body never fully relaxes, Van der Kolk states, showing how trauma leads to feelings of exhaustion, tension, and being perpetually on edge. This physical fatigue is a result of the trauma stored in the body. The brain's never-ending alarm system not only affects the body, but also weakens the immune system. This can make trauma survivors more susceptible to illness, and their immune responses may be compromised. The body's constant state of vigilance has a profound effect not just on physical health, but also on emotional well-being. Coping with trauma, restoring the balance between body and mind. Understanding how trauma affects the brain and body is a key step toward recovery. It may not be possible to erase the marks trauma leaves, but it is possible to learn how to live with them, Van der Kolk explains, stressing that healing requires restoring balance between the mind and body. Body-focused therapy methods, such as yoga, mindfulness, and breathing exercises, can help the body relax and heal after trauma. Van der Kolk notes that these therapies help reorganize the brain's overactive amygdala and prefrontal cortex. You can retrain your brain and heal your body, he says, referencing the concept of neuroplasticity. The journey toward healing after trauma can be long and challenging, but it is possible for the body and mind to regain their equilibrium. Van der Kolk's work serves as a guide for understanding the intricate relationship between trauma's effects on the brain and body. Recognizing that trauma is not just a mental wound, but a physical one too, is a crucial step in the healing process. Trauma can turn your brain and body into a prison, but there are always ways to escape, Van der Kolk emphasizes, offering hope that recovery is within reach. In conclusion, understanding how trauma leaves its mark on both the brain and body is not about erasing those marks, but about learning how to live with them. Although trauma may leave deep scars, healing is possible. Recognizing how the brain and body respond to trauma is the first step on the road to recovery. The body keeps the score, but it is in our power to rewrite those records, Van der Kolk affirms, offering a key insight into the path to the psychological and physical impacts of trauma are key themes explored in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma doesn't just leave lasting marks on the mind. It also affects the body. These psychological and physiological effects can significantly lower a person's quality of life. The dual damage caused by trauma makes the healing process complex. Van der Kolk emphasizes that understanding the mental and physical echoes of trauma is one of the most crucial steps toward recovery. Psychological impacts of trauma, the burden on the soul. The psychological effects of trauma create deep chaos in a person's inner world. People who experience trauma often can no longer perceive the world as they once did. They start to question their safety, self-worth, and their relationships with the world. Van der Kolk summarizes trauma's devastating impact on the soul by saying, traumatized individuals live constantly in the past, trying to predict the dangers that the future might bring. This statement highlights how trauma blends the past and the future, making it difficult for trauma survivors to stay present in the moment. One of the most common experiences after trauma is the sense of reliving the event. Traumatic memories resurface in a person's mind repeatedly. Sometimes these memories emerge unexpectedly, triggered by a sound, a smell, or an image. Van der Kolk explains this as, your mind might think it has forgotten the trauma, but your body keeps reminding you. A person returns to these memories involuntarily, creating intense anxiety, fear, and stress. These recurring memories also destroy a person's sense of security. The world no longer seems like a safe place. The feeling of insecurity distorts both the individual's relationship with themselves and with others, leading them to feel isolated, abandoned, or worthless. Van der Kolk describes how trauma erodes a person's trust in the world, stating, trauma severs the connection between a person and the world. Individuals struggle to trust others, which causes significant issues in their relationships. Physical impacts of trauma, the burden on the body. The physical effects of trauma are just as profound as the psychological ones. During a traumatic event, the brain prepares the body to survive. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, and breathing becomes irregular. These reactions are natural survival mechanisms during the trauma. However, if these responses continue after the event, they place an immense burden on the body. Van der Kolk captures this physical toll, saying, trauma is not just a mental experience. The body carries the scars of trauma. The body records the trauma, and these imprints manifest as physical symptoms. People who have experienced trauma often suffer from muscle pain, chronic fatigue, digestive problems, and headaches. These are all results of the body remaining in a constant state of high alert. Van der Kolk explains this by saying, trauma keeps the body in a fight-or-flight mode, which slowly wears down the body. After trauma, stress hormones remain at high levels in the body, weakening the immune system. This makes individuals more prone to illness, further diminishing their physical health. The body's inability to relax and its continuous state of vigilance significantly affect a person's quality of life. When the body is constantly in survival mode, its ability to heal itself is compromised. This is why people often struggle to physically recover after trauma. The relationship between psychological and physical impacts. The psychological and physical effects of trauma are deeply intertwined. Van der Kolk explains this complex relationship, stating, the mind and body are wounded together during trauma, so the healing process must involve both. In the process of recovering from trauma, it's essential to treat the body along with the mind. Van der Kolk highlights the effectiveness of body-focused therapies like yoga, breathwork, and mindfulness, which help the body process the trauma it has stored. Understanding both the mental and physical impacts of trauma is crucial for recovery. In conclusion, trauma's psychological and physical effects can be deep and long-lasting. However, understanding these effects and finding ways to cope with them is a key part of the healing journey. Van der Kolk affirms, the body and mind are wounded together, but they can also heal together, offering hope for recovery after trauma. Recognizing how both the mind and body respond to trauma is the first step toward overcoming it. The effects of trauma on the brain are one of the most deeply explored topics in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. During trauma, the brain reacts to danger with an immediate and powerful response. This reaction is a defense mechanism essential for survival. However, when these responses become permanent after the trauma, the brain's normal functioning is disrupted. The brain starts to live in a constant state of danger, and the person remains on high alert, even in ordinary situations. In this section, we will examine how trauma affects various parts of the brain and how these effects manifest in a person's daily life. The brain's alarm system, the role of the amygdala. Trauma activates the brain's danger detection center. The amygdala is the part of the brain responsible for triggering the fight, flight, or freeze response when danger is perceived. This response is critical during traumatic events, helping the body survive. However, after trauma, this mechanism becomes overly sensitive. Van der Kolk describes this with a striking statement: trauma keeps your brain locked in a constant state of war. Even when the danger has passed, the brain still perceives threats and remains on high alert. In other words, after trauma, the person continues to perceive danger even when no real threat is present. The amygdala starts to perceive danger in everything. A simple sound, smell, or image can trigger this perception. For example, a sound heard during a traumatic event can cause the same intense fear years later. The brain records the traumatic event and can replay it at any moment when triggered. As Van der Kolk puts it, the brain constantly relives the trauma. The danger from the past becomes the reality of the present. This continual replay disrupts a person's daily life, making it almost impossible to live normally when trauma is repeatedly re-experienced. The prefrontal cortex, silencing the voice of reason. Another crucial part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for thinking, decision-making, and regulating emotions. Normally, the prefrontal cortex helps balance the amygdala's fight or flight response during times of danger. However, after trauma, this area becomes weakened and cannot perform its functions effectively. Van der Kolk explains this as, trauma suffocates logical thought and replaces it with panic. After a traumatic event, the person struggles to think rationally. Their decision-making process and ability to assess situations are constantly clouded by the trauma. The weakening of the prefrontal cortex also makes it difficult for the individual to control their emotions. The inability to regulate emotions often leads to conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma survivors frequently experience sudden outbursts of anger, anxiety attacks, or deep feelings of helplessness. This happens because the brain has lost its ability to balance logic and emotion. Trauma disables the brain's braking system, Van der Kolk says, clearly explaining how trauma disrupts our emotional equilibrium, the hippocampus, memory, and trauma. Another critical effect of trauma on the brain is observed in the hippocampus, the area responsible for organizing memories and placing them in a timeline. After trauma, this area may also lose its functionality. Traumatic events are not processed properly by the hippocampus, leaving memories scattered and disorganized in the mind. Van der Kolk describes this situation as trauma distorts the timeline. Traumatic memories always exist in your mind, but you don't know where they came from or how they got there. This distortion intensifies the feeling of reliving the trauma. Trauma survivors frequently recall the past, but these memories are not arranged in a clear time or place. This uncertainty weakens the individual's connection to reality, leading them to feel as though they are experiencing the traumatic events in real time. This causes intense anxiety, fear, and stress. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reshape itself. One of the most hopeful messages from van der Kolk is the brain's ability to reshape itself even after trauma. Although the brain may be vulnerable to trauma's effects, it also has the potential to heal through a process called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's capacity to reorganize itself through new experiences. This process can be supported by therapy and body-focused practices. Van der Kolk explains, while trauma reshapes the brain, it can also be reshaped in the direction of healing. The brain's flexibility is one of the most crucial keys to recovery after trauma. Yoga, mindfulness, breathwork, and body-focused therapies can help rebalance the brain. By sending new and positive signals, the brain can begin to rebuild itself. Conclusion: the brain's healing potential. Understanding the effects of trauma on the brain is the first step toward recovery. Changes in key brain regions such as the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus form the foundation of the difficulties experienced after trauma. However, the brain's capacity to heal itself offers hope for overcoming these challenges. As van der Kolk says, understanding how trauma changes the brain opens the door to healing it. The brain may be vulnerable to trauma, but it also has the power to heal. The reshaping of the brain by trauma is a key concept in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, where he explores how trauma affects both the mind and body. Our brain is remarkably resilient in the face of traumatic experiences. This resilience allows it to reorganize itself despite the destructive effects of trauma. Van der Kolk delves deeply into how trauma changes the brain's functioning and how these changes can be reversed during the healing process. The brain's response to trauma is not just a short-term survival mechanism, but a long-term process that restructures the brain's functions and shape. How trauma reshapes the brain. When trauma occurs, the brain enters survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical thinking and emotional regulation, struggles to cope with the hyperactive amygdala during and after the trauma. The brain begins to reshape itself as if it were constantly under threat. Van der Kolk explains this by saying, trauma keeps your brain on constant alert. A past event replays itself in the present, and your brain reorganizes itself accordingly. After a traumatic event, the brain's reshaping makes the individual more sensitive to future potential dangers. The brain keeps the survival mechanisms it once used in place, which means the person overreacts to even the smallest triggers in their daily life. This process doesn't only affect the mind. It also alters the physiological structure of the brain, the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity. However, trauma doesn't mean the brain is permanently changed. Van der Kolk highlights the brain's capacity for recovery by emphasizing the concept of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize and restructure itself. This means that through new experiences, learning, and therapy, the brain can heal itself. Van der Kolk states, while trauma reshapes the brain, it can also be reshaped in the direction of healing. After trauma, therapy, especially body-focused therapies, can help the brain reshape itself. Yoga, breathwork, mindfulness practices, and techniques like EMDR, movement desensitization, and reprocessing assist in calming the brain's hyperactive regions. Van der Kolk explains that these therapies can help the brain rebalance itself after trauma. Our brain, when fed with positive signals, has the capacity to heal itself. Retraining the brain. Trauma reshapes the brain, but this process is not irreversible. Through learning and restructuring, the brain has the potential to recover. Thanks to neuroplasticity, damaged areas of the brain can form new pathways and return to healthy functioning. This process is like strengthening a muscle. It happens through consistent practice and repetition. Van der Kolk explains this by saying, it is possible to retrain the brain. The scars left by trauma do not disappear, but we can learn how to cope with them. This process of retraining aims to empower the individual. New neural pathways must be formed to leave the effects of trauma behind. Throughout therapy and the healing process, the individual learns how to manage the effects of their traumatic experience and reorganize their mental processes. Van der Kolk emphasizes that this is a long and patient journey, but the brain's flexibility and capacity for reshaping show that healing is possible. Turning vulnerability into strength, Van der Kolk also points out that trauma doesn't only create weakness, but that the healing process can make the individual stronger. The brain's reshaping process allows not only for coping with trauma, but for emerging from it more resilient. While trauma represents a period of vulnerability, healing and neuroplasticity can transform this vulnerability into strength. Van der Kolk states, trauma can damage your brain, but you can also strengthen it again. The brain has immense capacity to correct and heal the effects of trauma. While a person may not be able to completely erase the scars of their past traumas, they can learn to live with them and improve their mental processes. This happens not only through therapy and practice, but also by discovering the individual's inner strength. Conclusion: the brain's power to reshape itself. In conclusion, understanding how trauma reshapes the brain and how it can heal during this process is essential for coping with trauma. Trauma can change the structure of the brain, but thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain has the capacity for healing and restructuring. As Van der Kolk says, the brain may be shaped by the effects of trauma, but it can also be rebuilt. This is one of the fundamental aspects of the recovery journey after trauma. While the brain carries the marks of trauma, it also holds the power to manage and heal those marks. In Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, the effects of trauma on different regions of the brain are examined in depth. Each part of the brain reacts to trauma in distinct ways, and these reactions form the foundation of the challenges people face after experiencing trauma. Understanding how different parts of the brain respond is a crucial step in unraveling how trauma operates. The amygdala, the danger alarm center. During trauma, the amygdala, which is responsible for detecting danger and triggering survival mode, becomes hyperactive. When trauma occurs, the amygdala is on high alert, and the brain enters a constant state of searching for threats. Van der Kolk describes this as, trauma keeps your brain on constant alert, making past dangers feel as if they are happening now. An overactive amygdala causes individuals to overreact to situations that wouldn't normally be threatening. This leads to feelings of constant anxiety and hypervigilance in everyday life. The prefrontal cortex, the silencing of logic. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for thinking, planning, and emotional regulation. During trauma, this part of the brain struggles to counterbalance the amygdala's hyperactive responses. Van der Kolk explains, trauma drowns out the voice of reason, replacing it with panic. When the prefrontal cortex becomes impaired, individuals find it difficult to control their emotions, and their ability to think logically and make decisions becomes compromised. The hippocampus, scattered memories. The hippocampus organizes memories and places them on a timeline. However, after trauma, this part of the brain loses its functionality, leaving traumatic memories fragmented and disorganized. Van der Kolk vividly describes this by saying, trauma makes memories timeless. You don't know where or when they belong, but they are always there. This leads to the sensation of constantly reliving the past. The responses of these different regions of the brain show that trauma is not just a mental wound, but one that fundamentally changes how the brain functions. However, as Van der Kolk emphasizes, the brain can be reshaped, and through the healing process, the brain's responses to trauma can be balanced. Trauma is like a storm that throws our emotional world into chaos. During trauma, the brain and body go into survival mode, but often this state of alarm continues long after the event has passed. During this process, the brain's ability to regulate emotions is greatly disrupted. In The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk explores how trauma affects our emotions and the ways we can recover from this disruption. Trauma is not just an immediate experience. Its effects linger in the brain and body for a long time. Van der Kolk shows us that it is possible to find ways to heal these wounds and regain emotional balance. Trauma and emotional regulation, the loss of control. After trauma, our ability to regulate emotions is significantly impaired. The brain's immediate responses to danger continue even after the event is over. The amygdala remains in a state of constant threat detection, while the prefrontal cortex, the center of logical thinking and emotional regulation, becomes unable to control this overactive state. Van der Kolk explains this, stating, "Trauma disrupts your ability to control your emotions. Even a small trigger can bring you back to your old fears. In this state, individuals may experience sudden outbursts of anger, intense anxiety attacks, and a deep sense of helplessness. When emotional regulation is weakened, the person is at the mercy of their emotions. These emotional outbursts triggered by trauma deeply affect a person's relationships with both themselves and others. They may react excessively to people around them or, conversely, completely shut down emotionally. Regaining emotional balance, the path to healing. Van der Kolk emphasizes that it is possible to regain emotional balance, but this process requires understanding and reorganizing the relationship between the brain and body. One way to restore emotional balance after trauma is to retrain the brain's responses. Van der Kolk highlights the brain's flexibility, stating, "The brain is changeable. Although trauma reshapes the brain, it can also be reorganized toward healing. This is where body-focused therapies come in. Practices like yoga, breathwork, and mindfulness are effective tools for regaining emotional regulation. These therapies aim to balance the hyperactive amygdala and the weakened prefrontal cortex." Van der Kolk notes that practices like yoga play a crucial role in processing trauma in the body, stating, "Yoga and breathwork realign not only the body, but also the mind, emphasizing the importance of the body in healing." Therapies like EMDR, movement desensitization, and reprocessing also help the brain reorganize its response to trauma. The relationship between brain and body, holistic healing. Recovering from the effects of trauma is not just a mental healing process. The body must be included as well. Van der Kolk frequently emphasizes that trauma is both a mental and physical experience. Trauma is recorded not just in the mind, but also in the body. He explains, "The body holds this record, and even if a person is unaware, these marks manifest as physical tension, pain, and chronic stress. During trauma, the body goes into defense mode to survive. This leads to abnormal physical responses. Constant muscle tension, irregular breathing, and chronic fatigue are all physical symptoms of trauma. Therefore, to fully heal from trauma, one must understand the relationship between the brain and body." Van der Kolk argues that trauma must be processed along with the body. That's why yoga, meditation, and other body-focused therapies are so effective in reducing the physical symptoms of trauma. By healing your body, you can also heal your mind, Van der Kolk says, illustrating the strong connection between the body and mind. When the body and brain work together, the marks left by trauma begin to fade, and a person can regain their emotional balance. Conclusion: regaining emotional regulation. Trauma disrupts our emotional world and weakens the brain's capacity to regulate emotions. However, thanks to the brain's ability to reshape itself and the body's capacity to heal, it is possible to regain emotional balance. As Van der Kolk states, trauma wounds both the mind and body, but these wounds can heal. The strong connection between brain and body is key to the healing process after trauma. Body-focused therapies and the brain's neuroplasticity help reduce the emotional impact of trauma and assist in restoring a person's emotional balance. Trauma doesn't just affect our emotional world, it also deeply impacts our memory. The brain struggles to process traumatic events like other memories, and these memories are often stored in an unusual way. In The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel Van der Kolk explores how trauma affects memory and how these memories resurface repeatedly in our minds. How the brain stores traumatic memories. Under normal circumstances, the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for organizing memories, places our experiences on a timeline. However, when a traumatic event occurs, this process is disrupted. Van der Kolk explains this with a striking statement: trauma prevents you from organizing memories in time and space. Traumatic memories exist in a fragmented way in your mind, and you never know when or how they will resurface. Because of this effect, traumatic memories can suddenly re-emerge in a person's mind, either right after the event or even years later. During a traumatic event, the brain's fear center, the amygdala, is activated and records the event in a way that helps us survive later. However, because these memories are emotionally charged, they are not placed in a mental timeline. This is why people who have experienced trauma remember these events not as ordinary memories, but as if they are reliving them in real time. This reinforces the constant state of alert that trauma creates. As Van der Kolk puts it, the brain doesn't store trauma as a memory, but as a threat. This explains why traumatic memories are so powerful and repetitive. The repetitive nature of traumatic memories. One of the most challenging aspects of trauma is the way these memories keep resurfacing. A smell, a sound, or an image can trigger the traumatic event to replay in the mind. This creates an immediate and uncontrollable fear response in the individual. Van der Kolk describes the repetitive nature of traumatic memories as follows: for people who experience trauma, the past is an endless present. The event is relived over and over with the same intensity. Since traumatic memories are not processed like ordinary events, the person has a hard time leaving them in the past. Every time the memory resurfaces, it triggers intense physical and emotional reactions as if the person is reliving the event. When these memories are recalled, the body responds as though it's still facing danger, sweating, increased heart rate, and physical tension. Van der Kolk explains this by saying, when the body remembers trauma, it reacts with the same intensity as the mind. In other words, traumatic memories are not just mental experiences. They are also relived physically, coping with traumatic memories. There are ways to manage the repetitive nature of traumatic memories. Van der Kolk explains that it is possible to reorganize how the brain processes these memories. One of the most effective methods is EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing therapy. This therapy helps the brain process traumatic memories more logically and sequentially. EMDR uses eye movements to help the brain reprocess these memories and reduce their emotional intensity. In addition, body-focused therapies can be effective in coping with traumatic memories. Yoga, breathwork, and mindfulness help relax the body and allow the person to process these memories more calmly. Van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of this mind-body connection, stating, when you relax your body, you also relax your mind, and the repetitive effects of trauma begin to diminish. The brain and the imprints of trauma. The imprints trauma leaves on the brain can linger in a person's life, but they don't have to be permanent. Van der Kolk highlights the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity, explaining, the brain can reorganize traumatic memories, and during the healing process, these imprints can lighten. This means that through new experiences and treatments, the brain can reshape itself. This process is critical for reducing the effects of trauma and learning how to manage these memories. Conclusion: living with the imprints of trauma. Trauma leaves deep imprints on our memory, and these imprints can resurface repeatedly. However, it is possible to manage and lessen the impact of these memories on our lives. As Van der Kolk states, traumatic memories cannot be erased, but their effect on us can be lessened. Understanding how the brain responds to trauma and reprocessing these memories is one of the most important steps in the healing journey. Living with traumatic memories can be difficult, but with the right treatment methods, it is possible to cope with them and regain emotional balance. Trauma leaves deep and long-lasting marks on a person's life, especially when experienced during childhood, as its effects can carry into adulthood. In The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel Van der Kolk highlights how trauma, particularly in childhood, profoundly influences attachment processes. Traumatic experiences shape an individual's relationships with their family, social environment, and even themselves. Traumatic attachment forms the foundation for behavioral and emotional issues that arise in adulthood, stemming from the deep wounds of childhood. In this section, we will explore how traumatic attachment and childhood traumas manifest in adulthood and the role trauma plays in family and social relationships. Traumatic attachment, the feeling of insecurity. Traumas experienced during childhood deeply affect a child's sense of trust in their caregivers and environment. Van der Kolk explains, childhood trauma shakes a person's sense of security to the core. A child who experiences trauma perceives the world as an unsafe place. This feeling of insecurity shapes the child's relationships with others and themselves. Traumatic attachment can lead to a constant fear of loss in close relationships. People with traumatic attachment may feel an overwhelming fear of abandonment in their relationships, causing them to sabotage their connections. Van der Kolk emphasizes, trauma creates a constant sense of threat, even in the closest of relationships, highlighting how this attachment style can be destructive. Even though these individuals long for deep connections with others, they may either keep their distance or become overly dependent, damaging the relationship. The impact of childhood trauma in adulthood, invisible scars. Childhood traumas leave invisible scars that manifest in various ways during adulthood. Individuals who experience childhood trauma often carry feelings of insecurity, worthlessness, or inadequacy into their adult lives. Van der Kolk explains, the pains of childhood make it difficult to regulate emotions in adulthood. People who have been traumatized in childhood continue to bear these emotional burdens as adults, leading to challenges in their work, family, and romantic relationships. One of the most significant ways childhood trauma impacts adulthood is through a damaged sense of self-worth. Those who experienced neglect, abuse, or rejection as children often see themselves as unworthy or unlovable in adulthood. This perception can drive them into toxic relationships where they struggle to set boundaries and feel compelled to please others constantly. Van der Kolk states, trauma erodes a person's self-perception, and this erosion affects every aspect of their life. This reveals the profound depth of childhood trauma's impact on an individual's adult behavior and emotional regulation. The role of trauma in family and social relationships, repeating patterns. Trauma leaves deep marks not only on an individual's inner world, but also on their family and social relationships. Childhood traumas influence how people form relationships later in life. Often, individuals repeat the traumatic dynamics they experienced in their own families when they become adults. Van der Kolk explains this by saying, trauma creates repeating cycles in family relationships. A child learns traumatic behaviors from their parents and may replicate them in their own family as an adult. The cycle allows childhood trauma to pass from one generation to the next. For example, someone who experienced violence in childhood may exhibit the same behavior toward their own children as an adult. Traumatic attachment affects not only the individual's life, but also future generations. Van der Kolk emphasizes, the effects of trauma don't stay confined to one person. They spread into families and society. This highlights the widespread impact trauma can have, affecting not just the individual, but also their family and community. On a social level, traumatic attachment also impacts how individuals relate to others. People who have experienced trauma may become either excessively withdrawn or overly dependent in their social interactions. They struggle to find security and closeness, which hinders their ability to form healthy relationships in their social environments. These social effects of trauma can lead to difficulties in their professional life, friendships, and romantic relationships. Conclusion: understanding traumatic attachment. Understanding traumatic attachment is key to recognizing how childhood traumas manifest in adulthood and their role in family and social relationships. As Van der Kolk points out, trauma is not just an individual experience. It has generational effects. Traumatic attachment is a cycle that begins in childhood and can continue into adulthood. However, this cycle can be broken through proper therapy and awareness. Understanding trauma and working through its effects is an essential step, not just for the individual's healing, but for the healing of families and society as a whole. Healing from trauma is a complex and profound process. In The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk emphasizes that trauma impacts both the mind and the body, and thus healing must involve both. The road to recovery is not just a mental transformation. It requires the body to be a part of the healing journey as well. Van der Kolk discusses various methods of healing, including body-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), schema therapy, and mindfulness practices like yoga. These approaches help individuals cope with both the mental and physical aspects of trauma. Body-focused therapy, healing the physical imprints of trauma. The physical imprints that trauma leaves on the body are often overlooked, yet trauma is not just a mental experience, it is deeply felt in the body. Van der Kolk states, "The body keeps the score." Emotional pain echoes through the body as well. Body-focused therapy aims to alleviate the physical manifestations of trauma. Tension stored in the muscles, automatic physical responses to traumatic events, chronic stress, and pain can be relieved through body-based therapies. Van der Kolk advocates for techniques like yoga and breathwork, which can significantly help in physical relaxation and reducing the effects of trauma. These therapies regulate the body's physical responses to trauma, allowing individuals to have a more relaxed and peaceful bodily experience. Yoga helps reconnect the body with the trauma, Van der Kolk explains, emphasizing the crucial role the body plays in mental recovery. Body-focused therapies help process the traumatic memories stored in the body and calm the state of constant physical alertness. Cognitive behavioral therapy and schema therapy, cognitive transformation. Trauma affects not only the body, but also the mind, leading to deeply ingrained negative thought patterns that can be difficult to break. Van der Kolk explains, trauma reshapes the mind, distorting beliefs about oneself, the world, and others. Therefore, cognitive healing is essential as well. Cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) helps individuals recognize and change these negative thought patterns. Van der Kolk emphasizes that the harmful beliefs formed after trauma can be reshaped through CBT. This therapy allows individuals to identify thoughts that make them feel insecure, unworthy, or unsafe, and then teaches them how to challenge and reframe these thoughts. According to Van der Kolk, changing thought patterns is one of the most effective ways to lessen the mental effects of trauma. Schema therapy focuses on undoing negative thought and behavior patterns developed during early childhood. Schemas are cognitive frameworks formed during childhood to protect oneself from perceived dangers, but can later become obstacles in adulthood. Traumatic experiences can trigger these negative schemas, leading to self-destructive behaviors or relationship difficulties. Schema therapy helps individuals become aware of these unhealthy schemas and make healthier life choices. Van der Kolk explains, schema therapy restructures the deeply ingrained mental and behavioral patterns created by trauma. Yoga and mindfulness practices, restoring mind-body balance. Another significant path to healing from trauma is through yoga and mindfulness practices. Van der Kolk emphasizes that these methods are effective in regulating the mind and body's responses to trauma. Mindfulness helps the mind begin to reprocess trauma, he says, highlighting how these techniques can alleviate anxiety, stress, and recurring thoughts that often follow trauma. Yoga reconnects the mind and body, helping individuals become more aware of their physical responses. It allows them to consciously control the physical reactions triggered during trauma. While yoga stretches and relaxes the body, it also calms the mind. Mindfulness practices, on the other hand, help individuals observe their current emotions, thoughts, and bodily sensations without judgment. Van der Kolk explains, mindfulness allows individuals to recognize the automatic responses trauma has created and respond to them differently. These practices help reduce the stress responses triggered by trauma and assist in restoring the mind-body balance. Conclusion: paths to healing from trauma. As Bessel van der Kolk emphasizes, trauma is not just a mental experience. It is a bodily process as well. Healing from trauma requires work with both the body and the mind. Body-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and schema therapy help individuals cope with the effects of trauma, while yoga and mindfulness practices bring the body and mind back into balance. As van der Kolk puts it, the body and mind heal together. These methods are effective tools for overcoming trauma and allowing individuals to regain a healthy and fulfilling life. Trauma deeply impacts the brain, but despite the brain's vulnerability to trauma, its ability to heal and reshape itself is equally powerful. In The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk explores how the brain can reorganize itself after trauma. At the heart of this process is neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable capacity to form new neural connections and adapt. This ability to rewire itself, even after experiencing trauma, is a crucial aspect of healing. The brain's resilience and ability to create new neural pathways is at the core of the recovery process. Reshaping the brain, easing the scars of trauma. When a traumatic event occurs, the brain's danger detection center, the amygdala, becomes hyperactive, leaving the person in a constant state of alertness. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical thinking and emotional regulation, struggles to balance these heightened responses. However, the marks trauma leaves on the brain are not necessarily permanent. The brain can reorganize itself and heal from these changes. Van der Kolk emphasizes, the brain has the capacity to heal the wounds left by trauma. While trauma can cause dysfunction in certain brain regions, the brain has the ability to form new neural connections to compensate for these disruptions. This allows the person to regain emotional and mental balance and better cope with the effects of trauma. The process of reshaping the brain can be supported by therapy and positive experiences. Van der Kolk explains, the brain can restructure itself when it receives the right signals. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity for healing. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to form new neural pathways and reorganize itself. This capacity is the foundation of healing after trauma. Van der Kolk describes neuroplasticity as, the brain is shaped by past experiences, but it can also be reshaped by new ones. In other words, the changes trauma causes in the brain do not have to be permanent. Neuroplasticity occurs as neural connections between brain cells' neurons are strengthened. Every new experience, learning, or therapeutic intervention helps form new connections in the brain. This process aids individuals in overcoming the effects of trauma. For example, yoga, mindfulness, and other body-focused therapies help re-regulate the brain's automatic responses to trauma by encouraging the formation of these new neural connections. Van der Kolk explains, when the brain creates new pathways, the effects of the old traumatic pathways weaken. The process of forming new neural connections, learning and rebuilding. Every new experience opens a new pathway in the brain, and as these pathways are repeated, they become stronger. Van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of this process in healing from trauma, stating, every new experience creates a new path in the brain, and this path can replace the old scars of trauma. This process allows individuals to develop new habits and behaviors in the aftermath of trauma. Trauma often creates negative thought patterns and automatic responses in individuals, but as new neural connections form, these unhealthy responses can be replaced by healthier ways of thinking and acting. Therapy and mindful practices assist in this process by helping the brain reorganize itself. Van der Kolk explains, retraining the brain is one of the most important steps in overcoming the effects of trauma. Yoga, meditation, and breathwork are examples of body-focused therapies that help the brain create new neural connections. These practices calm the automatic responses the brain has developed in response to danger, making it easier for new pathways to form. Van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of the body's role in this process, stating, when the mind and body work together, healing becomes stronger and more lasting. Conclusion: rebuilding the brain after trauma. Trauma deeply impacts the brain's functioning, but the brain has the capacity to overcome these effects and rebuild itself. Neuroplasticity offers hope for healing after trauma, as new neural pathways can be formed to reduce the effects of old traumatic responses and build healthier mental structures. As Bessel van der Kolk states, the brain can open new pathways to erase the scars left by trauma. When supported by therapy, learning, and new experiences, it is possible to overcome the effects of trauma and regain a balanced life. The power of neuroplasticity is a key component of the healing journey. While our brains may be shaped by the experiences we've lived through, they also have the capacity to reorganize themselves. Recovering from trauma is possible by harnessing this ability, allowing individuals to build a new life beyond trauma.